So I'm going to continue talking about taxes. And let's see. So I'll give a little bit more context. Taxes are kind of half of public economics. One important half of public economics is the public goods, and like the government provides public goods, it corrects externalities, and that's sort of all on the expenditure side. But the other important part of public economics is where the government gets money from. And basically, money that the government gets is called a tax. And there are a variety of different taxes. Let me talk through the different types of taxes that exist. Okay, starting with an excise tax. Okay, an excise tax is a tax on a particular good. Okay, one good example would be like gasoline. Every gallon of gasoline, there is a fixed tax added on to that. It's buried in the price that you pay at the pump. I think it's like 53 cents a gallon in North Carolina. Okay, it's a tax specifically on purchasing gasoline. Okay. A tax on a specific good or a specific service is called an excise tax. There are a handful of goods that are like directly taxed. There's a tax for that good only. Gasoline, new cars, cigarettes or tobacco. These are some of the examples of things that are taxed directly. Now, excise taxes on their own are not super common. However, pretty much every tax is a modified version of an excise tax. Okay, excise taxes. We usually describe them as one of two ways. Either a per unit tax, okay, just add on a fixed cost to each unit that's purchased. So think, for example, of the, Think, for example, of the gasoline. There's a tax of 53 cents added on to each unit, each gallon of gasoline that a person purchases. The other style is an ad valorem tax, okay, which is a percentage of the price. Okay. Ad valorem is Latin for based on the value of, but it's a percentage of the price of the good. Now, in some ways, it doesn't make much difference for us economists. Either tax works the same way. And, if we do our analysis of the impact of a 20-cent tax when a good costs $1, it's the same as the analysis of the impact of a 20% ad valorem tax on a good that costs $1. It really doesn't make much difference for our analysis, though I will make a note. Usually we analyze things as if they are per unit taxes. Okay, so excise taxes. Now, next. A type of excise tax, sort of, is a tariff, which is a tax on an imported good. Okay, so one place where specific goods are taxed at different rates is when it comes to imports. And a specific good from a specific country might be taxed in a specific way, okay? The same good from a different country is taxed differently. A different good from the same country is taxed differently. So, for example, there's a tariff on steel imported from China. That is a tax specifically paid by people who are importing steel from China. Okay? Doesn't apply to other imports from China, doesn't apply to steel from other locations. It's, like, again, essentially an excise tax. In the past, like in the 1700s and 1800s, tariffs were one of the main sources of revenue for the US government. Now, personal income taxes are. Now, tariffs are usually used as a matter of protectionism. In other words, to protect a U.S. industry from foreign competition. Okay, so that tax on Chinese steel is not intended to raise revenue so much as it's intended to make Chinese steel less competitive with American steel. Okay, is that clear? Okay. By the way, I mentioned tariffs used to be a bigger deal for governments in days of yore. Think of the Boston Tea Party, right? The colonists were upset about a tax paid on tea imported from Britain, right? A tariff. Okay, continuing. Sales taxes. Okay, a general sales tax is a percentage of the price of almost all goods. Okay. You all know how sales taxes work, probably. You go down to the grocery store, you pick up a box of widgets. The box of widgets is labeled as costing $100, but when you check out, the cashier asks you for $106.75 because of sales tax, right? I think here in Alamance County, the sales tax is 6 3/4%. I think that's right. Okay, so again, it's almost like an excise tax that's applied to all goods fairly uniformly. Sales taxes are established by local governments. So the money goes to like state, county, and city governments. Okay, and for that reason, like the sales tax rate will differ from one county to another, or even be different for a city inside a county. Let's see. Oh, as I said, sales taxes are a fixed percentage of the price of almost all goods. There are some goods that are exempted from sales taxes, but it varies from place to place. I think in North Carolina, food, like basic food, unprocessed food, vegetables, meat, dairy, pasta, are taxed at 2%, so a lower sales tax than everything else. Okay, that kind of different taxation is common. Okay, so sales taxes. Okay, all of those are really taxes on consumption. Then we come to income taxes. Income taxes are the big source of revenue for the federal government, especially. By the way, just as a note, there's no federal sales tax. There's no national sales tax in the U.S. Other countries have that, but for complicated reasons, probably something in the Constitution, there's no national sales tax. Okay, income taxes. Again, these are the big source of revenue for the government. There are two types of income taxes: Personal income taxes are what most people think of when they think of income taxes, or even when they think of paying taxes to the government, they think of their personal income tax. People pay a share of what they earned in the previous year, or their income in the previous year. Okay. Based on a person's income. The other type of income tax is a corporate income tax. So corporations, businesses, pay taxes on their profits. In other words, the money they bring in minus their costs of doing business. Okay, so corporate income taxes are taxes on the profits of businesses, the revenue they bring in minus their costs. Okay, and corporate income taxes are getting some attention right now. President Biden has suggested raising the corporate income tax rate, I think, to 28%. So in other words, corporations, businesses would be required to pay 28% of their profits to the government, which might be up from 18% currently, or 21%. Just to give some perspective. Okay, now personal income taxes. Again, that's what most people think of as their taxes they pay. Personal income taxes are levied or charged by the federal government. Most states have an income tax, and a few cities have income taxes. Okay, the federal income tax is the big deal. This taxes people anywhere between about 10% and 40% of their income. State income taxes, I think for perspective, North Carolina has a 3% income tax. Okay, and I know of no cities in North Carolina that have an income tax. However, like the city of New York City has its own income tax, and all residents of New York City pay income tax to the city government. Okay, let's see, states. There are a handful of states that have no state income tax. Anyhow, all different levels of government tax income. And an important thing about personal income taxes is that the rate people pay varies. For the most part, the more income they earn, the higher the tax rate they pay. The percentage they pay to the government increases. Okay, now other taxes. Let's see, there's something called a capital gains tax. Okay, capital gains tax is a tax paid when you sell at something at a higher price than you paid for it. Okay, the two common applications, places where it shows up, are when people sell stocks in companies. So like if I buy $100 worth of stock in the Acme company, and then a couple years later I sell it for $120, the difference between what I paid and what I sell it for, that $20, is called capital gains, and I pay tax on that. It's not income, it's a different type of tax, it's taxed at a different rate. These things are complicated. Another place where it shows up is when selling property. If I buy my house for $100,000 and a few years later sell it for $130,000, that $30,000 increase in price is a capital gain, and I pay tax on it. Okay, let's see. Speaking of property, there are property taxes. Property taxes are an important source of revenue for especially local governments. And property taxes are usually charged on like land, buildings, vehicles. Okay. Expensive, durable property. And these are usually a percentage of the value. Okay. So, again, to give a realistic number, I believe that in Orange County, which is just one county over where I live, it's about 1.5% of the value of my home. So every year I write a check to the county government for 1.5% of the value of my home. This is actually different from any of the other taxes in that it's not based on buying or selling something like all the other taxes. This is based on just owning something, having something. Okay, and as I said, most of this goes to local governments to pay for things like police, fire, parks, water, like all kinds of local public services, water, sewage, and the big one, schools. Okay, again, local public services. And what else should I add on the list? Maybe a couple other minor ones. There is an inheritance tax in the U.S. It gets a lot of attention, even though it's a fairly minor thing. The way that the inheritance tax works in the U.S. is, I think right now, kind of when your rich great uncle dies, he pays about 40% of what he hands down to his heirs, 40% of what he hands down over $11 million. Okay, so the first $11 million that he passes down to heirs is not taxed. Above that threshold, it's a 40% tax on the value of what he passes down. Okay, inheritance taxes. Along with that, there's a gift tax. Even if your rich great uncle doesn't wait until he dies, but gives you money before he dies, it can be taxed. And the final thing I'm going to put on this list is really more theoretical than anything else. It's a lump sum tax. Okay, which would be just a fixed amount. In other words, not based on anything. It might be that everyone pays an equal amount to the government. The government just comes along and charges everyone $3,000 tax, no matter what you did. It's different from all the other taxes on the list. It's different from every other tax in that it's a tax that does not depend on anything you did. Sometimes economists talk about a lump sum tax as sort of an ideal in the sense that it doesn't distort behavior. Every other tax changes behavior. People will either consciously or unconsciously behave in ways that reduce the amount of tax they pay. So again, since the tax is based on behavior, people change their behavior. That change in behavior is what leads to dead weight loss. Okay, a tax that is not dependent on on what you do, just a fixed amount. Government charges everyone a fixed amount, is ideally efficient. Now, there's a big practical problem with this, which is there's no guarantee that people will be able to pay their tax bill. Okay, so I think that gives you all an idea of different types of taxes and a little bit of information. So now I'm going to return to some topics that I discussed on Thursday. Some important stuff. One is taxes reduce surplus. They make us unhappy for two reasons. One is very simple and obvious. They take money from us. But the second reason is this dead weight loss. They change behavior, and that is inefficient. So imagine the following scenario. As I kind of said on Tuesday, my salary here at the university is roughly based on how many courses I teach. And imagine when I'm discussing with my bosses how many courses I'll teach next year, my bosses say, hey, how about another $1,000 to teach another class? And I think about it. I think about the opportunity cost, what I could be doing instead with my time, and how much that's worth to me. Okay, and there's some amount to that, a few $100 for sitting at home and watching TV. Okay, so there's my opportunity cost. And then I weigh that against what I get from teaching the class. Now, my boss is saying I'm going to get $1,000 for teaching the class, but then Uncle Sam comes along and takes out some income tax. Okay. A couple of things happen. Okay. Let's suppose that my opportunity cost, let me just give it a number, is $600. That's how much I value sitting at home. So if I take this job and I pay no tax, I receive $1,000 from my boss, and my opportunity cost is $600, which leaves me with $400 of surplus. Are you clear on that? Okay. Then, government raises the income tax to 10%. Okay, well, I get $900 for teaching the class. My opportunity cost is $600. So I end up with $300 of surplus, and $100 goes to the government. Okay, now, there's been no dead weight loss yet. Okay, I've been made less happy, but that was this tax revenue that goes to the government. Okay, then raise the income tax to 20%. Well, I clear $800 after tax for teaching the class. My opportunity cost is $600, so I get $200 of surplus, and the government gets $200 of revenue. Okay, so raising the tax rate, it brought me more unhappiness, but it's all just this tax revenue. It's just going to the government. There's been no change in behavior and no deadweight loss. Okay, we could keep doing this, but when we get to a tax rate of 50%, that means that I could teach the course and I would end up with $500. Well, my opportunity cost is $600, so I'm going to decide no. I'm simply not going to teach the class. It's not worth my time. Okay, in that case, if I don't teach the class, how much surplus do I get from teaching the class? Nothing. How much tax revenue does the government get? None. Okay, the tax has changed my behavior and it has created deadweight loss. Like any lower tax rates, there would have been some surplus for me and some revenue for the government. Okay? Up to, a combination of $500 of surplus for me plus what the government gets. Those would add up to $500 until the tax gets so high that I quit working, and then the government gets no surplus, or the government gets no revenue and I get no surplus. That's the deadweight loss. Okay? When people don't get surplus because the tax has changed their behavior. Generates no revenue for the government, generates no surplus for me. Okay, now, as I've noted here, any tax will reduce both the consumer and producer surplus. Okay, I hope it's not too arrogant of me to think that my employer gets some surplus from hiring me. That, my employer benefits from hiring me, and I provide more value in services than what they pay me. Okay, in some sense, they profit off me. So, if that's true, then when I quit teaching because the tax gets too high, of course, it hurts me, but it also hurts my employer. Okay, so this is the point that I'm making here, that actually the tax will impact both buyers and sellers. I wrote consumers and producers, but buyers and sellers, both sides of the market, even if it's an income tax that I, the seller of labor, have to pay, it impacts my employer, the buyer. Okay, so a tax paid by one side of the market can impact the other side as well. In fact, will impact the other side as well. And this is the next point here. Actually, the impact of the tax, how it changes consumer surplus and producer surplus, actually has nothing to do with who officially pays the tax. And it could be the case that my employer has to pay a tax for hiring me, and they might have to pay a $100 tax, $200 tax, $500 tax, $600 tax. And we could think through what my employer would do in those scenarios. It turns out that as the tax they pay goes up, what they are willing to pay me goes down, and at some point, they can't pay me enough to overcome my opportunity cost, so I quit working, even though this is like a hypothetical tax that the employer pays for hiring me. It can still impact me in exactly the same way as a tax I pay for working. And the key thing is, I'll talk about this later, what really determines how the tax impacts buyers and sellers is elasticities. Elasticity of supply, elasticity of demand. Okay, so where do I want to go next? I'm going to move forward to model of the market. And this is a market for widgets. By the way, this basic model, this is a model of an excise tax where we just add on, I keep saying like a $T per widget tax. This model can, in fact, be used for just about any of the other taxes, except for like property taxes and lump sum taxes don't fit within this. But we could be talking about even a labor market, for example. I could just relabel some things here, be like not the market for widgets, this is the market for my labor. This quantity is the number of courses taught in a year. Price per course. Price per course. Okay, and then the market has some equilibrium, number of courses I teach, price paid per course. And then in the next slide, I'm going to talk about what happens when there's a tax placed on widgets, but we could just pretend it's an income tax. Puzzles me. Why? Okay. Could be like instead of a $T per widget sold, okay, an income tax that amounts to $200 for each class I teach is like a tax on the number of like units of labor I supply. Anyhow, for the example, I am going to call it a market for widgets. Okay, my market for widgets is in equilibrium where demand and supply intersect. Here is, just to be clear, this is the market before any tax. Next step. Okay, I identify these areas of surplus. And I'm going to say this over and over. These areas of surplus are supposed to represent how much happiness some group gets in the market. Like this market brings consumers of widgets happiness. Like they enjoy the widgets they buy. And it brings profits to producers of widgets. That's the producer surplus. The way that they look in these pictures are some particular areas. The area for consumer surplus is, I'm going to describe this consistently, it's the area between the demand curve and the amount that consumers pay for each widget out to the quantity that they purchase. Okay? Now, in this model with no taxes, there's just like a single price that consumers pay. It's the same as what producers receive. Once I bring taxes in, there's going to be a difference between what a consumer pays and what a producer receives, what a buyer pays and what a seller receives. Think of going to the grocery store and you buy your box of widgets. It has an official price of $100, but you have, and that's what the store will receive from selling it, but you have to pay as a consumer $106.75. Okay, that's what you pay. There's a difference between what consumers pay and what producers receive. The difference is the tax. Okay, but in this market with no tax, there's just one price, P star. Producer surplus, everything between the supply curve and the price that producers receive, the amount they receive for each widget they sell, okay, as far out as the quantity sold. Okay, next, let me bring in my tax. Okay. Let's imagine that consumers have to pay a tax of $T on each widget they purchase. Okay, blue is their original demand curve. So this original demand curve, D, that's really what they are willing to pay for different quantities of widgets when there were no taxes. So it might have been the case that me personally, I would have bought a widget for $12. Okay, and that's some point on that blue demand curve. So, like here's me, a quantity of one widget at a price of $12. Okay, now the curve in red represents demand if I have to pay a tax. Okay, so if I have to pay a tax of $3 for each widget I purchase, in the absence of a tax, I would have been willing to pay $12 for a widget. If I have to pay a $3 tax, now I'm willing to pay $9 for a widget. Is that logical? Do you understand the logic? Like, just what I'm willing to pay has been shifted down by the amount of the tax. Blue is like really my willingness to pay. The red demand curve is what I'm willing to pay to the seller if on top of that I have to pay a tax, a $T per unit tax. Okay, the red demand curve, if I have to pay a tax on top of the price to the seller, that is just shifted down by the amount of the tax. The whole demand curve gets shifted down by the amount of the tax. So let me get rid of some of this junk. Okay, so the red demand curve is my demand if I'm going to have to pay a tax after I purchase it. And the new market equilibrium will happen where the supply curve intersects this new demand curve. So right here, this point, as a matter of fact, let's see. Okay, this point that's shown in my next slide. Okay, got it? Okay. Okay, up here, equilibrium, EQM, without the tax. The new point, this is the equilibrium with the tax. Okay, if we compare those 2 points, like the equilibrium price when there was no tax was P star, and the quantity sold was Q star. Now, I can make a clear prediction, which is that the quantity sold will go down. People will purchase fewer widgets when the government taxes them. They've become more expensive. Another thing is that the price will come down. So widgets have become cheaper, but that's a little bit misleading to say cheaper. It's cheaper not including the tax. Yeah? So a box of widgets that had sold for $50 when there's no tax, the price will come down when there is a tax, okay? But consumers will still pay more on top of that. Okay, sorry, this is getting confusing. Next slide. I try to show these two things. There is P prime is like the official market price. Okay, but I've also marked P double prime as what consumers pay, including the tax. Okay, so this is where I'm going to start talking about things as if there are two prices. There is a price to consumers and a price to sellers. There's an amount paid by consumers, which is different from the amount received by sellers. Okay, again, I hope that's clear, that there are these two prices, one what is paid, the other what is received, and they are separated by the amount of the tax. Okay, I'm going to make one additional note right here. Actually, two additional notes. One note is, Victoria, thank you for nodding as if you understand things, because it makes me feel like I'm actually getting through to people. I hope that's true for others as well. This is an unpleasant lecture to give, because I have to talk about these weird ideas. Okay, but the other note is that Q prime, remember, that's the quantity that is sold when there is a tax. Okay, that occurs where the difference between the demand curve, Q prime happens where the difference between the original demand, and original supply are exactly the amount of the tax. Okay. This gap between the demand curve and the supply curve is the amount of the tax, T. Okay? If we were to go back to the initial picture that just showed the two demand, like the original supply curve and original demand curve, for any tax T dollars, there's exactly one place where the gap between the demand curve and the supply curve is exactly T. And that's going to be where the new market equilibrium is. I'm just going to mention that, and it'll show up again later. Okay, so let's see, two prices. Okay, consumer surplus and producer surplus. Consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the price that consumers have to pay, out as far out as the quantity purchased, Q prime. Producer surplus, area between the price received by producers and the supply curve, as far out as the quantity sold. Okay. Then the area of tax revenue. Okay, that's the thing the government cares about. It's this purple triangle. So tax revenue, if you were to calculate that, the amount of the tax revenue is the number of widgets sold times the tax per widget. Okay, T dollars for each widget sold. So you multiply quantity sold, Q prime, by the amount of the tax, T, and you'd get the total tax revenue. As it turns out, this rectangle here, the area of that is Q times T. The width of it is Q and the height is T. So the area of that rectangle is exactly Q times T. It's the same as the tax revenue. Now, the next, I identified dead weight loss. Okay, in the model with, or when there's no tax, everything between the demand curve and the supply curve out to the place where they intersect, all of that was surplus, either consumer surplus or producer surplus. When there is a tax, the area of surplus goes only as far out as Q prime. Okay? that remaining triangle to the between Q prime and what would have been the equilibrium quantity, this area is deadweight loss. Okay, it's the loss of surplus because the tax changes behavior. People don't purchase as many widgets as they would have purchased, and that leads to deadweight loss. Okay, in the same way that like taxing my income would eventually cause me to work less, and when I work less, I get no surplus, and the government gets no revenue. That's inefficient. That's deadweight loss. Okay? That is exactly what's going on in that gray triangle. Those are people who are no longer purchasing widgets, so they're not getting the happiness they could have gotten from purchasing a widget. They are also businesses that are not selling and making profit from selling widgets because the tax, because of the tax, or the tax is changing people's behavior, and that's all consumer surplus or producer surplus, producer profits, that's gone. Okay. Now, if I want to do this whole lecture, I'm supposed to explain to you all that putting a tax on producers of widgets will result in the same outcome, okay? So, I mean, like, imagine yourself in the position of a policymaker, and you're trying to decide whether you should tax people for purchasing widgets or tax them for producing widgets. Which way would you want to raise money, okay? What would be the difference between taxing producers and taxing consumers? So I walked through the analysis of what happens when we tax consumers of widgets. The next thing for me to do is talk about what happens when we tax producers of widgets. By the way, here's one example, or let me give an example where this political issue sort of comes up. It's with Social Security taxes. Oh, hell, I forgot to mention one type of tax earlier. Oh, shoot. Backing way up. Remember at the start of the lecture I talked about different types of taxes. One other thing, payroll taxes. Okay, these are taxes on labor income. Okay, paid either by workers or employers. Okay, a notable payroll tax is the Social Security tax. Okay, goes to fund Social Security benefits, but mainly retirement benefits, Social Security retirement benefits. There are also other taxes like for unemployment benefits. Okay, are funded with a payroll tax. Workers' compensation for injuries on the job are funded with another tax on labor. Okay, all of these are paid by either the worker or the employer or some combination. The Social Security tax is 14% of what a worker earns. Okay, in other words, 14% of what I earn in every paycheck is owed to the government as Social Security tax. Would it make a difference if workers pay the Social Security tax or employers pay that tax? And, well, the way that it is in fact set up is so that each side pays the same amount. I, as a worker, pay 7% of my income to Social Security, and my employer pays the same amount towards Social Security. Okay, So on the surface, it appears that we are paying the same amount for the tax, right? That we're sharing this evenly. Turns out that's all an illusion. Who pays the tax on paper doesn't determine who really feels the burden of the tax. A tax placed on one side of the market can get passed on almost entirely to the other side of the market by changing prices. We could tax producers of widgets. They had been selling widgets for $50 each. We slap on a $10 per widget tax. That doesn't necessarily hurt the widget manufacturers if they can raise the price of their widgets to $59. They are passing on most of the burden of the tax to consumers in the form of higher prices. Okay, it depends on how much they can pass on the tax to the other side of the market. Okay, now, again, I should go through this analysis, but I kind of want to go through it fast. Okay, I'm going to have slides online if you really want to look at the details again. The important thing, okay, first important thing is a tax that is paid by suppliers will shift up the supply curve. So blue is like the original supply curve without any tax. Okay. And then red is the supply curve if the producers have to pay a tax. Okay, have to pay T dollars for each widget they produce. Okay. Just as before, this will shift the curve by exactly the amount of the tax. If my widget company previously was willing to sell 2 widgets if it could have received a price of $15 for each, when the government adds a $3 per widget tax, now I'm willing to sell 2 widgets if I get $18 each. Okay, again, without the tax, I would sell 2 widgets for $15. If it's a $3 per widget tax, I'll sell 2 widgets for $18. Just shifts up what I need to get by exactly the amount of the tax. Okay, make sense? I mean, logical? Okay, and then there will be a new equilibrium in the market. Okay, I've marked here the equilibrium in the absence of the tax, where the blue supply and demand intersect. With the tax, the equilibrium will occur where the new supply curve intersects the original demand curve. Okay? So there's a new quantity. Q prime is the quantity sold in the market. Okay, and that has fallen from what would have been sold in the absence of a tax. Okay, so the tax reduces the quantity sold. Now the equilibrium price in the absence of any tax would have been P star. And the price has increased. Okay, now this is kind of one difference between the earlier tax that was paid by consumers and this tax, which is paid by producers. This tax causes the price to increase, but it doesn't change, but that is purely because the price here has the tax built into it. And so P double prime is what consumers end up paying, okay? No tax on top of that. Okay. So this is what consumers pay. And that is exactly the same as what consumers would have paid if they were the ones responsible for the tax. Okay. Now, there's a second price, which is what producers receive. So here, at Q prime, there is what consumers pay, and that goes to producers, but then producers have to send a check to the government, and so what producers receive after sending the tax check to the government, what producers receive is P prime. Okay. The difference between the two is the amount of the tax. Okay, so again, we've got these two prices. One is what consumers pay, the other is what producers receive, and they are separated by exactly the amount of the tax. Okay, another thing to note, I'm going to bring your attention to the fact that Q prime, the quantity sold when there is a tax, occurs where the original blue demand and supply curves are separated by exactly T dollars, whatever the tax was. Okay. This means that Q prime in this model, where producers pay the tax, is the same value as Q prime in the previous model when consumers pay the tax. Okay? A T dollar tax will result in the same quantity being sold, whether it's a T dollar tax paid by producers or a T dollar tax paid by consumers. Okay. On top of that, going back to these prices, remember there's a price that consumers receive and a price that there's a price that consumers pay and a price that producers receive. There's also, like for reference, we could compare that to the equilibrium price of P star. Okay, so with no taxes, the price would have been P star dollars. What happens with the tax is the price that consumers pay goes up, and what producers receive goes down. Okay, and that is the same whether the tax is paid by consumers or paid by producers. What consumers end up paying consumers end up paying more and producers receive less, regardless of who officially pays the tax. Okay? Always, some of the tax gets shifted to the other side of the market. Yeah, okay. Areas of surplus. Area of consumer surplus is above what the price that consumers pay up to the demand curve. The area of producer surplus is below the price that producers receive down to the supply curve. Okay, so those are the areas of surplus. There's what is that? Sorry. Okay. Then there's an area that corresponds with the tax revenue. Okay? Again, a rectangle, the width of that rectangle is the number of units sold, the height is the tax per unit, multiply those together, and you get the amount of the tax. Okay? And then finally, the area of deadweight loss. Okay? This picture and the areas of surplus are exactly the same as when it was the model that consumers paid a $T per widget tax. Okay? Again, we've talked about two completely opposite scenarios. One is consumers have to pay a tax when they purchase a widget. The other is a scenario where producers have to pay a tax every time they manufacture a widget. Okay. Turns out both have the same end results in terms of quantity sold will be Q prime either way. The areas of surplus, consumer surplus, producer surplus, will be the same in both scenarios. The area of tax revenue, the same in both scenarios. Area of deadweight loss, the same in both scenarios. The price paid by consumers, same in both scenarios. The price received by producers, same in both scenarios. Okay, and that's what I've got listed up here. Okay, these two options that we might consider, a tax paid by consumers versus a tax paid by producers. For all practical purposes, they lead to the same result. Okay, they are perfectly equivalent. And maybe it's worth knowing this, like, first, if you're just thinking about taxes and whether you support or oppose some tax policy, it's useful to know that who actually pays, who the tax is officially levied on, like who actually pays the tax bill is not necessarily the same as who the burden really falls on. That's true for all kinds of taxes. Okay? Taxes always get moved to someone else. So right now, the president is bringing up some proposed changes to the tax system, including raising the corporate income tax, which seems like a great thing if we want to take money away from rich corporations. But who officially pays the tax, corporations, is not necessarily the same as who feels the burden of the tax. The burden can get shifted on to someone else. As a matter of fact, the burden does get shifted on, it does get shifted to others. Okay? That tax on corporate income that I was just talking about, some of the burden will fall on, oh, sorry. Sorry, it's my fire department calling. Okay, never mind. Sorry. Some of the tax revenue will in fact come from the profits of shareholders of the company. But some of it will be passed on to, some of the burden will be passed on to consumers of those widgets. Some of the burden will fall onto workers at those factories or those businesses. The burden gets shifted around. Got it? That's like the bigger, broader lesson here. Okay. Now, next topic that I'm supposed to discuss is, again, the burden doesn't necessarily fall on whoever officially pays the tax. So the burden of an income tax, the personal income tax, might not really fall on the taxpayers, the people paying themselves, the people actually doing the, like writing the tax checks. It could fall onto the other side of the market. It could end up being a burden on employers. Okay, so like what really determines who bears the burden of the tax? Like whose surplus has been reduced? It depends on elasticities, okay? And my general explanation is that backing up, elasticities are important with taxes. And they are important in two different ways. One is that it is inefficient. It causes deadweight loss to tax something where behavior is responsive to price. The whole problem of deadweight loss occurs because people change their behavior in response to higher taxes. It's that change in behavior that leads to deadweight loss. So the less they change their behavior, the less deadweight loss there is. Okay? Changing behavior a little bit is called inelastic. Okay? So taxing behaviors that are inelastic result in the least deadweight loss. That's one place where elasticities are important. The other place where elasticities are important are when comparing how the burden falls on the two sides of the market. I think of it as if the two sides of the market are trying to get out of paying the tax, changing their behavior in order to not have the burden fall on me. Whichever side of the market can change their behavior more will feel a smaller share of the burden. They can pass the tax on to the other side in the form of lower prices or higher prices. Okay, but I get to do the model. Yay for models. Okay, here's a model of a market for widgets, and I've drawn a steep supply curve and a relatively flat demand curve. Okay. When demand or supply is elastic, remember that means a relatively large response to a price increase, the curve is relatively flat. And when demand or supply is inelastic, the curve is relatively steep. Okay, let me show you all how that works here. Let's think about what happens to quantity demanded and quantity supplied if the price were to increase from, let me call this P1 to P2. Okay, what happens first on the demand side of the market? At a price of P2, the quantity demanded, we go over to the demand curve, that quantity demanded is QD2. At a price of P1, quantity demanded, go over to the demand curve, quantity demanded would have been QD1. So if the price were to increase from P1 to P2, quantity demanded would go down from QD1 to QD2. It's a pretty big change. It's not a scientific term, but it's a pretty big change in quantity demanded. Okay. Supply, on the other hand. Okay. If the price goes from P1 to P2, the change in quantity supplied, let's do that. Our price of P1, quantity supplied is QS1. At a price of P2, quantity supplied is QS2. Okay? So when the price increases, quantity supplied increases from QS1 to QS2, but it's a fairly small increase in quantity supplied. That's it, and it's directly linked to the slope of those curves. Okay, so that flat demand curve represents the fact that demand is fairly responsive to changes in prices. The steep supply curve indicates that supply is not very responsive to price. Okay. These consumers are very attentive to how much they pay, and if the price goes up much, they're going to stop buying it. Okay. Meanwhile, the producers, the sellers, it's almost like they have a quantity that they've got to sell no matter what the price is. Like, that's the extreme version of being perfectly inelastic. There's a quantity that needs to be sold regardless of the price. Okay. The supply side of the market is a little bit like that. The amount they sell doesn't depend much on price. Okay, so demand, supply, markets in equilibrium in the absence of a tax, and so forth. Next step, I create a tax on these widgets, a tax paid by buyers of widgets. Okay, and now the tax will shift the demand curve down by the amount of the tax. Okay, the market will have a new equilibrium where this new demand curve intersects the supply curve, and there will be a new quantity that's sold in the market, U prime. Okay, there will be a price in the market, P prime, but that's not the whole story. This is a price, this is kind of the official price of the good, but what consumers pay is more than that. Consumers pay the price plus the tax. So P double prime, this point, is the price plus the tax. And that's what consumers end up paying. Okay, now I'm going to point out a couple of things. One is that the the official price has gone down a lot. And that is what the producers actually receive. Okay? What consumers pay, including the tax, has gone up a little bit relative to a market with no tax. Consumers are paying a little bit more, but there's been a big drop in the price that producers are receiving. Okay? So from P star to P double prime, that is how much more consumers pay, including the tax. But the change from P prime to P star, that is how much less the producers receive. And even though this is a tax that is paid by consumers, it actually has little impact on what consumers pay for the good. More than impacting the consumers, it's impacted the sellers because it's resulted in a lower price. Okay? Consumers were very sensitive to the tax, raising the cost of their widgets, and they stopped buying widgets. Then in response, the sellers had to slash their prices in order to continue selling widgets. Okay? So they had to bring the price way down, and the sellers had to absorb most of the cost of the tax in order to keep consumers purchasing widgets. That's the story here. And again, I can explain the different impact on buyers and sellers in terms of how much their prices have changed, The price has gone down a lot for producers, has increased a little bit for consumers. I can present that same argument in terms of how much revenue is really paid by consumers, that little blue rectangle, versus how much revenue comes out of producers' profits, the big yellow rectangle. I can divide the deadweight loss between the two of them. And a lot of the deadweight loss comes from the producers, just a little from consumers. Okay, all these are different ways of showing that most of the burden of the tax falls on producers, even though it's officially consumers who pay it. Okay, then I've got another situation that tries to mimic the same setup, a tax on purchasing widgets, on consumers of widgets, except the shapes of the demand and supply curves are different. Here, the supply curve is relatively flat, flat-ish, and the demand curve is steeper. Okay, the same type of tax will change prices. P star had been the equilibrium price in the absence of any tax. The tax causes the demand curve to shift down by exactly the amount of the tax. There's a new equilibrium that occurs where the new demand curve intersects the supply curve. Okay, again, this point right here. New equilibrium quantity Q prime. There is a price paid for widgets, P double prime. But what consumers actually end up paying with the tax is P prime. Okay, and so the amount that consumers pay has increased a lot. So this is the increase in what consumers pay, while the amount that producers receive has decreased a little bit. Decrease in what producers receive. Okay. The amount of the tax is the same in these two scenarios I've just done. The only difference is how elastic demand and supply are. This case, supply is more elastic, and there's been a small decrease in the price received by producers, but most of the impact of the tax falls on consumers. They are the ones who end up paying a much higher cost for the good. Now I've got pictures that show the tax revenue from the consumer versus the tax revenue that comes out of producers' profits, and a picture showing how much of the deadweight loss comes from consumers versus how much from producers. These are all different ways of showing that when supply is more elastic than demand, everything is worse for the demand side of the market. They are the ones who have to pay a lot more. They are the ones who end up paying most of the tax, or most of the tax revenue comes from them, as well as most of the deadweight loss is from their side of the market. It's always the more elastic side of the market that feels a smaller burden of the tax, because they can shift the tax to the others. They can shift the tax onto the inelastic side of the market. They can respond in ways that it's easier for the elastic side to respond in a way that'll shift the burden onto the side of the market that cannot easily respond. Okay. Again, that's my best explanation. Oh boy. So, I think that's most of my talk about, most of my talk about elasticities. I know, it's not the funnest topic thank you, Sophie, for nodding. It's not the funnest topic, but we economists like it. We like talking about taxes. I'm the only person in the world, no, aside from accountants, who find these topics interesting. Okay, so I'm going to switch topics a little bit to some principles of taxation. Like, how should a government set up the way that it taxes different things? What are some ideas that it should keep in mind when it's deciding how much to tax different goods? Okay, so I'll start with a couple of simple things. For, like, when you're appointed the dictator of a new country and you're deciding how you want to tax people, first things that you might keep in mind, a couple of minor points. One is corrective taxes. We talked about those a little bit. Corrective taxes are kind of a specialty thing in order to reduce externalities. Yes?
Is this like the same concept? You talked about something where, I forget what it was called, but if like a good is a necessary good that you know people will buy, then they just like raise the taxes on. Oh, well, we talked about price, but I feel like it could be the same concept with taxes. They know you need to make income so they can make it as high as, not as high as they want, but they can make it high.
Yes.
What do we
Okay.
think about it? Just like not making income.
Yeah, exactly. So you're tying this to elasticities, and like how much you should tax something depends on its elasticity, because as we talked about with elasticities, if demand is inelastic, you can raise the price a lot and people don't have many options to respond. That's exactly right. Yeah, that's going to be my next point right here. Okay, yeah. First thing, when you're thinking of setting up your taxes, remember corrective taxes. It's a kind of minor thing, but sometimes we tax specific goods in order to discourage smoking or driving or something else. Okay, second thing is efficiency. And one rule for efficiency, right? So efficiency is minimizing deadweight loss, is that you want to tax goods where behavior, where demand and supply, or demand or supply is inelastic. Okay. Where people cannot much change their behavior in response to the tax. When I explain it in terms of deadweight loss comes from the fact that people change their behavior in order to avoid paying the tax. And that's the source of deadweight loss, also known as inefficiency. But Sophie worded this a different way, which is also exactly correct, which is that when you tax goods that are inelastic, people don't change their behavior much. They continue buying it, so the government has the opportunity to raise taxes a lot, and people don't respond. So the two things are connected. Even, maybe they don't seem to be, but they are exactly connected. Now, this is maybe, I think, part of the rationale, but I shouldn't say that, rationale behind inheritance taxes. Okay. So that once a person has acquired a lot of wealth, what can the person really do with that? Either spend it or pass it on to the next generation. like, and um, there's not much way to avoid paying the inheritance tax, except by spending your money while you're still alive. Okay? And so maybe that's a rationale. I think that's a rationale behind taxing estates highly, estates like money that's passed down to heirs. Okay, as it turns out, people can in fact do a lot to avoid paying inheritance taxes, and they do a lot. They do in fact do a lot to avoid paying estate taxes or inheritance taxes. So they end up being very inefficient taxes. Okay? There's a whole industry called estate planning, which are lawyers and accountants and economists who understand like the different rules for taxing different things and ways that people can try to get rid of large amounts of wealth without paying much tax on it. Again, it's a whole little industry devoted to trying to change behaviors or find ways to change behaviors to avoid paying taxes, which means it turns out to be an inefficient tax. Okay, but I've mentioned those two things as principles for taxation. Next are the ones that I really want to pick up on. One is something called the benefits principle. That if you're going to design a tax system, it seems fair if how do I say this? The people who benefit from something pay for it. Okay? So you want to tax people, if you're trying to fund some public good, you want to tax the people who will benefit from it. Probably the most clear application of the benefits principle is the highway tax. Okay? This is that gasoline tax. When you go and buy a gallon of gasoline, you pay 53 cents in North Carolina. That goes toward funding highways, building and repairing highways. Okay? And I expect you all can understand the fairness behind that. The people who use the highways are paying the tax that repairs and builds the highways. They're paying for it for the highways that they're using. And people who use the highways more tend to spend more gas. They pay more in tax. People who never drive pay no gasoline tax. And, so they're not taxed for maintaining roads, building and maintaining roads. So here's probably the most direct application of the benefits principle. Social Security taxes go to fund Social Security benefits. Okay, so the people who benefit from the Social Security program are the same as the people who pay the taxes. All right, so another example that I'd like to think about, property taxes. I'm going to put a question mark here. How well do property taxes satisfy this benefits principle? Well, remember, property taxes are used for the most part to fund local public services. Okay, so police, fire, public schools, the town government, and so forth, water, sewage, and so forth. Now, maybe on the one hand, it satisfies the benefits principle in that local, like you pay your property taxes to your local community for the local public services. They're not being used to pay for national public services. That money is being used to pay for things in your local community, which is where you live. So the people paying the tax are getting the benefits directly in their community. But, okay, so that's one thing in favor of, like, yes, it does satisfy the benefits principle. But then the other thing is, it's the amount of the property tax is proportional to how much property you own. So if you own a more valuable property, you pay more in property taxes. Do you get more benefit? Okay. Remember, like with the gas tax, people who drive more will end up paying more for gasoline and end up paying more for highways. Okay, so the people who pay the most tax are the people who are using the highway the most. When it comes to these local public services, are people with more valuable properties getting more from the local government? Okay, maybe not. Okay, I will point out, like fire protection, that probably works pretty well with, or fits pretty well with the benefits principle. You have a more valuable property, you benefit more from fire protection. And it's kind of like the value of a fire department depends on the value of your property that you own. So good for that one. Policing, I'm not sure. Public schools, maybe not, okay? Who pays for public schools but doesn't benefit from them? Yeah. People who go to private schools. Okay. And, yeah. Yeah. I mean, we could just simplify it and say people without kids in public schools. Okay. So people without kids in public schools still pay property taxes to fund their public schools. And again, even though they're not getting any direct benefit from that, it seems a little bit unfair, right? It's a direct violation of this benefits principle, and it seems unfair. And that's kind of what the benefits principle is saying. Now, it's not a hard and fast rule. It's just like an idea to keep in mind that if you want to be fair, think about the fact that the people who benefit from something should also, or maybe also, should be the ones who pay the taxes for it. By the way, I brought up as an example of the benefits principle working well, the fact that gas taxes are used to fund highways. But there is a little bit of a violation there. Doesn't work perfectly. Who benefits from highways without paying tax? Yeah. Okay, public transportation. Now, Victoria, I could argue with you that cost gets shifted onto people in the form of, or to passengers in the form of higher fares. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah. So
okay, but that they pay for it indirectly. Now that's part of like that whole lesson about burdens can be shifted around. But you are thinking along the right lines. Yes. Electric cars. Okay, those damn electric cars. They don't pay highway taxes, which are based on gasoline consumption, but they use the highways. So there's a clear violation of the benefits principle. Okay, so I guess you all just should understand this is one idea for a good way or a good idea to keep in mind when setting up a tax system. The other thing is, the other principle is ability to pay. We want to ensure something very simply, that everyone can pay their tax bill. Okay? And it seems a bad idea or it seems that it'll create problems if we charge people more in taxes than they can pay. And so this is a reason why maybe like public defense, like military protection against invasion from other countries, is something that probably provides us all with the same benefit, everyone in the country. So if we want to abide by the benefit principle, I suppose everyone should pay the same amount. We take the amount of money that's spent on national defense, like the Pentagon's budget, and divide it equally among all Americans, and everyone ends up paying $3,000 a year to fund the military. Well, the problem with that is some of you all don't have the $3,000 in your checking account to pay for it. Okay? So we can't always tax people according to their to their benefit. We should always consider whether people can pay their tax bills. More practical thing is, well, we'll come to that in a second. Ability to pay. So here's a neat thing. Taxing income. You always have ability to pay. Yeah? If I am taxed some percentage of my income, that percentage is anything less than 100%, I am guaranteed to have enough to pay my tax bill, enough money in my bank account to pay my tax bill. Taxing consumption, same thing. Okay, consumption, what I purchase. Because we can guarantee that I will have enough to pay my consumption bill or like sales tax in the minimum, like or at the extreme. I am required to pay no sales tax when I purchase nothing. So you will always have enough money to pay whatever sales tax you owe. Otherwise, you simply don't purchase the thing. Okay, so again, that satisfies this idea of ability to pay. Let me very quickly mention one type of tax that maybe does not satisfy the ability to pay principle. Okay, it is property taxes. Sort of do and sort of don't. Okay, on the one hand, I will always have enough assets that I can pay my property taxes. If my property taxes are 1.5% of the value of my property, I always have at least that much in assets, though I might have to sell my house in order to be able to pay my property tax bill. But I do at least always have more in assets than what I owe. That's the way in which it satisfies the ability to pay principle. But the problem is that money might be hard to get to, and I might have to sell my house in order to do it. Then it doesn't really satisfy this ability to pay principle. Okay, this is in fact a problem for people on fixed incomes. Okay, mainly retirees living on pensions. Okay, they might simply not get enough in pension money each year to pay their property taxes. This is a real problem. Okay, I'm more than out of time. Thank you all for your patience. I will let you all go home now so you can study for your test.